2 hours ago, a classified Pentagon briefing document was referenced in open session by a senior Senate Armed Services Committee member. And what he described before his microphone was cut has sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry on the planet. Not because of what he confirmed, because of what he almost said. The strike on Iran was not the end of a strategy. It was the opening move of one. 3 words circulating inside Washington's national security apparatus right now. Phase 1 complete. The official position from the White House remains unchanged. This was a targeted, limited operation aimed at degrading Iran's nuclear infrastructure and neutralizing ballistic missile launch capacity that posed an imminent threat to regional stability. Contained, proportionate, finished. But the intelligence picture emerging from Allied capitals tells a different story entirely. And the question being asked in London, Ankara, Riyadh, Beijing, and every diplomatic corridor that matters is no longer, why did Washington strike Iran? The question is, who is next and how soon? To understand why that question is being asked with such urgency, you need to understand what the Iran operation actually accomplished, and more importantly, what it deliberately left unresolved. First, the strikes degraded Iran's Fordow and Natanz facilities. But military analysts note that both sites had already transferred significant enriched material to secondary locations over the preceding 8 months. The Pentagon knew this. The strikes eliminated infrastructure, not capability. That is either a significant intelligence failure, or it was the intended outcome. Eliminating capability entirely would end the crisis. Eliminating infrastructure while leaving capability intact creates a justification for a second phase. Second, the operation did not target Iran's proxy network. Hezbollah's command structure in Lebanon was untouched. Houthi operational capacity in Yemen was untouched. Iran-aligned militia networks across Iraq and Syria were untouched. A genuine effort to neutralize Iranian regional power would have required coordinated strikes across 5 countries simultaneously. That did not happen. What happened instead was a strike narrow enough to be legally defensible, but broad enough to establish precedent. The precedent that the United States will conduct unilateral military action against sovereign nations based on its own security assessments, without UN authorization, without NATO consensus, and without a defined endpoint. Third, and this is where the briefing room goes quiet, the post-strike target assessment conducted by U.S. Central Command identified 17 separate nodes of concern that were excluded from the Iran operation by direct White House order. Not because they lacked military significance, because they fall inside the borders of 3 other countries. But this is where it gets serious. The question of who is next is not speculative. It is being actively war-gamed inside the Pentagon right now, and the contours of that planning are visible to anyone reading the signals correctly. Look at the repositioning of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group over the past 11 days. It did not return to its standard patrol zone after the Iran strikes. It moved northwest, toward the eastern Mediterranean. That is not a post-operation wind-down posture. That is a forward deployment posture. Look at the emergency resupply convoys flowing into the U.S. base at Al-Tanf in southeastern Syria over the past week. Al-Tanf sits at the intersection of the Iraq-Syria-Jordan border triangle. It has no strategic value for an operation that is over. It has significant strategic value for an operation that is continuing. Look at the quiet diplomatic activity happening in Amman, Jordan, where senior U.S. military officials have held 3 unannounced meetings with Jordanian counterparts in the past 9 days. Jordan shares a border with both Syria and Iraq. It does not share a border with Iran. Those meetings are not about an operation that has concluded. The architecture of what comes next is being assembled in plain sight. The only question is the sequence. 3 countries are now being discussed in Washington's strategic planning circles with a frequency that should concern every government in the region. Syria sits at the top of every assessment. The Assad government's relationship with Iranian military infrastructure is structural, not incidental. Iranian weapons transit through Syrian territory. Iranian-aligned militias operate openly from Syrian soil. Iranian drone technology has been tested and refined in Syrian airspace. Eliminating Iranian proxy capacity without addressing Syria is the strategic equivalent of cutting a weed at the stem and leaving the roots entirely intact. Senior Israeli military officials have made this point explicitly in back-channel communications with their American counterparts. The argument is straightforward. The Iran operation created a window. That window will not remain open indefinitely. Yemen presents a different calculus, but an equally pressing one. Houthi forces have demonstrated the capacity to threaten Red Sea shipping lanes, disrupt Gulf energy infrastructure, and strike Israeli territory with ballistic missiles and drone swarms. The Iran operation degraded the supply chain that feeds Houthi capability, but did not eliminate it. Pentagon planners are working with a timeline model that projects Houthi operational recovery within 4 to 6 months without further intervention. That recovery timeline is now a planning deadline. Iraq is the most politically complicated and strategically significant variable. Iranian-aligned militia networks operating inside Iraq, some of them formally integrated into Iraqi state security structures, represent the most direct and immediate threat to American forces in the region. There are approximately 2,500 U.S. military personnel in Iraq right now. They are surrounded by forces that answer to Tehran. A decision to expand operations could trigger the most dangerous force protection situation American military planners have faced since Fallujah. What happened next, when the Senate microphone was cut, stunned even senior officials who had been tracking the situation for weeks. The international response to the Iran strikes has already begun reshaping the diplomatic landscape in ways that directly affect what comes next. China's position deserves close attention. Beijing issued a formal condemnation of the strikes, but what is more significant is what China did not do. It did not activate the mutual defense provisions of its 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Iran. It did not convene an emergency UN Security Council session. It did not move naval assets in the Persian Gulf. China condemned the strikes loudly in public and did nothing consequential in private. That combination of maximum rhetoric and minimum action tells analysts one of two things. Either Beijing has decided Iran is not worth a direct confrontation with Washington at this particular moment, or Beijing is calculating that a destabilized Middle East serves Chinese strategic interests in ways that a defended Iran does not. Russia's response was even more revealing. Moscow issued a 3-sentence statement calling for restraint. 3 sentences. For the military strike on a country with which Russia has significant strategic ties. Senior Kremlin watchers noted that Russia's Syrian operation, which protects Assad's government and by extension preserves Russian Mediterranean naval access, was conspicuously absent from Moscow's statement. Russia did not warn Washington against further strikes. It warned against escalation in general terms. That is the language of a government that is managing its exposure, not defending its allies. Turkey's position is creating the most acute anxiety inside NATO headquarters in Brussels. Ankara has refused to characterize the Iran strikes as legitimate self-defense under international law. Turkey shares a border with both Iran and Syria. It controls the Bosphorus Strait, through which any significant Russian naval reinforcement to the Mediterranean would need to pass. And it hosts the Incirlik Air Base, which American military planners have historically relied upon for regional operations. Turkey's cooperation, or its absence, is not a peripheral factor in what comes next. It is a central one. The American business and financial community has not yet processed what a multi-phase regional operation would mean for energy markets. When that processing begins, the numbers are stark. The Strait of Hormuz handles approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day. That represents roughly 21% of total global petroleum liquids consumption. Iranian mining of the strait, which Tehran has threatened explicitly and has the capacity to execute, would not raise energy prices. It would detonate them. Goldman Sachs's commodity desk has modeled a Hormuz closure scenario, resulting in oil prices reaching levels not seen since the post-invasion Iraq chaos of 2003, adjusted for current demand. American consumers, who experienced $5 gasoline in 2022, have not experienced what a genuine Hormuz disruption would produce at the pump. Beyond energy, the supply chain implications extend to sectors that receive almost no attention in public coverage of this situation. Semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan and South Korea source specific rare materials through supply routes that transit the Persian Gulf. Disruption to those routes does not slow chip production. It stops it. The American technology sector, which has spent the past 2 years rebuilding supply chain resilience after COVID-era shortages, would face a disruption of a categorically different magnitude. The American Petroleum Institute has already begun quiet conversations with congressional staffers about strategic reserve release protocols. The fact that those conversations are happening now, before any expansion of operations, tells you something important about how the energy industry is reading the trajectory of this situation. Which brings us to the strategic reality that Washington's planners are confronting right now, and that no public statement from the White House has come close to acknowledging. The Iran operation has created a logic that is very difficult to interrupt. Having established that the United States will strike preemptively based on its own security assessment, not striking the next node creates a question that is politically damaging in its own way. If Fordow justified military action, why doesn't the Hezbollah missile arsenal in Lebanon? If Iranian ballistic missiles justify strikes, why don't the Houthi missile systems that have already struck Israeli territory and Saudi infrastructure? The logic of preemption, once activated, generates its own momentum. Trump faces 3 paths from this point, and none of them are clean. The first path: contain the operation to Iran and accept that the proxy network, Hezbollah, Houthi, Iraqi militia, remains operational and will reconstitute Iranian capacity within 12 to 18 months, at which point the entire strategic calculus resets at a higher level of regional instability than existed before the strikes. The second path: expand operations sequentially against proxy infrastructure in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, accepting the risk of a regional war that draws in actors, Turkey, Russia, China, whose participation would transform a military operation into something that has no historical precedent in the post-Cold War era. The third path: use the Iran strikes as leverage to negotiate a comprehensive regional security framework, accepting that negotiation requires engagement with governments and actors that Washington has spent years treating as beyond the table. That path requires a different kind of political will than launching strikes. And it requires a negotiating partner willing to talk after being bombed. 2 hours ago, the Pentagon thought it had delivered a controlled first strike with a defined strategic objective. 2 hours later, the map it produced looks nothing like the map it intended. The Iranian nuclear program is degraded but not eliminated. The proxy network is intact and mobilizing. The Allied consensus that Washington assumed would follow the strikes has not materialized. And the question being asked in every capital that matters is the one question the White House has not answered. Phase 1 is complete. Nobody in Washington will say out loud what Phase 2 looks like. But the carrier strike group moving northwest, the resupply convoys heading to Al-Tanf, and the closed-door meetings in Amman suggest that somebody, somewhere in the building, already knows. The most consequential military decision of this decade was made 2 hours ago. The most consequential military decision of the next 6 months has not been announced yet. But the signals are already there for anyone willing to read them. And the world is watching very carefully.